Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm so happy to talk with Elle Hardy. She's just come out with a really good book. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it. It's called Beyond Belief, How Pentecostal Christianity is Taking Over the World. So welcome to Mindshift Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I've really enjoyed your book, and it took me back to when I was in seminary. We studied pneumatology, which is the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. And I remember going through some of the stuff you talk about in the book. We talked about the Toronto blessing, and I was like, okay, I see where you're going. I'm fascinated by the history of it, though. Maybe we should start there. Who are the kind of seminal figures that started this movement around the turn of the century, somewhere around there?
Yeah, very much so. So I think it's important to really see the Pentecostal movement as coming out of that 19th century America frontier culture. So it really was, when, especially during and after the Civil War, where, people were making do with what they had, and itinerant priests were kind of wandering the country, and people were going through terrible hardships, and a local an itinerant minister coming up and maybe offering you some healing or something was quite a powerful thing. And there was also that really uniquely American rugged individualism. There's a lot of stuff that you can trace back to your Waldos and all that kind of stuff that I think really shows through the religion and just kind of dominates the world that we live in. But yeah, basically in the book, I look at three key figures who I think really brought Pentecostalism into, sort of forming it into its own movement and to what it is today. So I start with Charles Fox Parham. So he was a renegade Methodist preacher in Kansas. And he apparently in his pomp, he could clock 250 words a minute. And so he was pretty good at what he did, and he fell out with authorities pretty quickly. And he was interested in some ideas that were certainly getting traction at the time that perhaps some of the more mainstream denominations weren't so thrilled with. So he was really, really invested in healing, and he and his young son had some real sickness problems. And they so he moved to Topeka, Kansas, and started Bethel Healing Home. So to try and put all of this, stuff into practice. And he also had a prayer study group, and they were trying to bring on the Holy Spirit and this idea of speaking in tongues that is in the Bible. And it had really died out around the 3rd century AD. Some monasteries did it. I think Catholics generally, especially in the Middle Ages, thought it was, something that needed to be exercised. Some Orthodox groups were doing it in monasteries. There were some hints that some German Presbyterians and some Scottish Presbyterians were involved in it a bit in the centuries leading up to the 19th, but it was something that was, sort of seemed to be spoken of in hushed terms. And he had this prayer group, and he got them, believing in the powers of the Holy Spirit and the powers of healing. He obviously must have been doing something for himself to have a following. And they sort of had an all-night prayer vigil on New Year's Eve, 1901.
Only 100 years off.
yeah.
What's 100 years?
Yeah, what's exactly in the cosmic theme?
Nothing.
And they were trying to bring on the Holy Spirit. And one of his followers, Angus Osman, began speaking in another tongue. Which they thought at the time was Chinese. Quickly learned, as a lot of early missionaries did when they thought they were given the power of tongues to speak in foreign languages and go out and convert people. A lot of them died of dysentery and some pretty horrible things once they got to China and learned that they might not have spoken the language. But back then they really thought they did, and Parham kept praying for it himself, and he said he eventually fell into Swedish a few days later. But the really key effects, it was sort of reported in local papers and things like that. But, this is Kansas. It was still pretty small then. And he sort of started traveling around the area, so down into, Oklahoma and Texas and places like that, and convincing people, that this great thing had happened. And he started to gain a bit of a following, and he opened a seminary school in Houston. And in 1905, he, had a number of students, one of whom was William J. Seymour. And he was the son of freed Black slaves from Louisiana. He'd wound up, I think he was born in 1885. He wound up fleeing the South as a young man because it was getting pretty awful for emancipated Black people. And I think importantly, he'd really grown up in Louisianan tradition, which was Catholic, but very African spiritual. And I think that really becomes important in the Pentecostal story. So he was sort of wandering around and, working in factories. He was in Indianapolis. At some point, he lost an eye due to smallpox. And he was a very, very pious man. And I think he'd converted to Methodism by then. But he had, he'd been umming and ahhing about becoming a minister. And he saw this loss of his eye as God's punishment for taking his time and not heeding the call to ministry. So he wound up going to Houston and studying under Charles Fox Parham. And Charles Fox Parham was not a nice dude. He was very much should we say he was a man of his time. But he did accept this Black preacher in, but the Jim Crow laws meant that William J. Seymour had to get his study out in the corridor. So all the white men sat inside and William J. Seymour sat outside. But Parham certainly saw something in him. He was a gifted, Seymour was a gifted orator as well, and started taking him out on street corners and saying, well, I'll preach to the whites, you preach to the Blacks. And really saw something in Seymour, and Seymour obviously had a talent, and Seymour saw something in him. He, believed in this power of the Holy Spirit that he was talking about. So soon after that, Seymour got offered a job to minister to a church in Los Angeles. So he went up there and quickly, he's bent on theology, I suppose you'd call it. He fell out with the congregation and they locked him out of the church. So he and a small group of friends and followers were basically trying to do the same thing as Parham did, bring on the Holy Spirit through fasting and prayer rituals. So a group of them did that, and eventually, there was an explosion one day in the congregation, basically, and the Holy Spirit moved, and it struck a lot of people there. But the interesting thing, the difference was, and why Seymour is generally credited as the founder of Pentecostalism, even though, he's a Black man in 1906, was newspapers. It was Los Angeles. It was a bustling city. It was growing. There were people from all over the country and the world that were moving there, for their opportunity. It was the end of the frontier. It was really seen as an important place. And, there was some pretty big and awful newspapers there who were reporting every detail in really salacious details. And, it was classically Pentecostal. So it was, people falling around and shaking and, singing and whooping and stomping and frenetic and ecstatic and all those things you still associate with Pentecostals today. And then the other big thing that also happened, I think it was the day that it hit the newspapers, so it would have been a few days earlier, but that same day was the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And Pentecostals back then were very premillennial and real proper end of days are coming types, and this was seen as a huge thing. So it just people started coming from all over Los Angeles and then all over the country, all over the world to see this congregation. And Seymour's congregational revival lasted for about 3 years, which is about as long as they tend to last. The fire just kind of goes out a bit, but yeah, they were the real two early figures.
But that was the famous Azusa Street revival that everybody talks about, right?
Yes, it was. Sorry, I forgot to name it. It's one of the really funny things I learned during my travels. I mean, on my last day in America, when I was finishing writing the book, I was in Los Angeles and chatting to a really pious young Latino woman in Los Angeles, who goes to a congregation not far down from Azusa Street. And I asked her about it, and she's like, what's that?
Never heard of it.
Never heard of William J. Seymour.
Wow.
Recites Bible passages from memory, but that's just how decentralized and sort of almost the history of Pentecostalism is foreign to so many of its adherents.
It really is. But then there's another real famous character in that, who is Amy Semple McPherson. So you've got this really fascinating mix of African Americans, sort of people of color in a poor, very downtrodden kind of area of Los Angeles, and then You've got Amy Semple McPherson, so you got a woman in there as well. So around the turn of the century, this is like incredible stuff, which is it's informed Pentecostalism even to this day, hasn't it? So what can you tell us about Amy Semple McPherson?
Yeah, very much so. Sorry, I'll just apologize to your listeners now. I'm recovering from COVID, so I might be coughing a little
No,
bit.
it's okay.
I won't be transmitting it to anyone through the screen.
We're just glad you're here.
Yeah, so Amy Semple McPherson is a fascinating character, and she's such a so classically kind of Pentecostal, fascinating, flawed, did some incredible things for people, and enriched herself along the way. She's just she's a real sort of proto-televangelist, I suppose you'd say. She really got going in the early 1920s, and she took those sort of initial strains of this movement, which by then had sort of fanned out all across North America and huge parts of the world. People had set sail pretty quickly for South Africa, Korea, China, all sorts of places. And she was really, again, just a product of that early Pentecostalism, which was people from all different races sitting side by side, women allowed to preach, very working class. But she was sort of the product of what I call a Salvation Army stage mom. She, her mother was extremely ambitious, and they sort of always had a very fraught relationship throughout her life. But she went out with a husband. She married young, and they set sail for China with a lot of early missionaries, and he died from dysentery more or less once they hit land. So she came back home and married another. So that was her first husband, Semple. So she came home and married McPherson, and then found that she had a real talent for preaching herself, and she was involved with some people up in Chicago, in Zion City, and which was basically, I think someone called it a large-scale securities fraud.
It is kind of a theocracy.
There were some really interesting figures. Voliva, the famous flat earther, and so there's a lot of stuff happening in Chicago there, which I won't go into for now. But she was involved in that and discovered that she had a real talent for preaching, and she sort of set off on an American sort of roadshow. But I guess she kind of packaged it up, I guess, made it a little bit more commercially viable, a little bit more palatable. She learned a lot and learned quickly. And I think her mother, again, was that really towering influence. And they did things like, started putting the people who were falling to the floor and shaking in ecstasy into side tents, and just making the whole experience a bit more wholesome, you might say. And she started the Foursquare Church, which, is still strong in many places. And she also, she might have been the first woman in the world to have her own radio channel. That's kind of in dispute, but she really got the idea of packaging it up and making it a bit more consumer friendly, and in using modern media techniques. She really got that from the beginning, and she really helped take it to the masses, both in America and around the world.
Yeah, she had a few scandals of her own, as so many televangelists do now. Pentecostalism, as you say in the book, it is the fastest growing Christian denomination in the world, isn't it? It's exploding all over the world, which we'll get into because you traveled all over the place, and I'm fascinated to hear your sort of field research. But one of the things that strikes me is, on the one hand, you've got sort of these theological distinctives. So you got things like speaking in tongues and healing, and then you've got this prosperity gospel, and that appeals to the poor, the working class, the people of color coming out of that sort of background. But you've also got women involved in there as well. So from the very beginning, you've got this just fascinating mix. And I think one of the people that you interviewed in your book said, what people want now is they don't want to just hear about God. They want an experience of God. And it seems to me that from the beginning, the tongues and the miracles and the healings and all the things that supposedly were going on, that was a much more immediate and accessible experience, wasn't it, than sort of the dry mainstream Christianity of the day?
Yeah, as someone said to me in a favela in Rio, again, sort of had no idea who Seymour or any of these people were. But because in Brazil, people are converting like wildfire from Catholicism. I think it'll be in the next year or two that it will probably, it might be about 2030. They think that Pentecostals will overtake the number of Catholics in Brazil. But Brazil might already be the most Pentecostal nation on earth, just by weight of population. But yeah, someone said to me in the favela, the Catholics say you can have a good time in the next life. The Pentecostals say you can have a good time in this life. And that is hugely important. It's a religion of the working poor. It's a religion of minorities, of migrants, of people feeling alienated in big cities, all sorts of stories like that sort of repeat over and over again around the world, and that I think is one of the most important factors in why it's so popular, and why, some people estimate there's about 35,000 people a day converting, which is a lot of people.
It could be alarming depending on whose perspective you're you're looking at. As a former evangelical, now I would be alarmed, but back in the day, I used to teach church growth and all those sorts of things. So I was thinking, as I was reading through your book, okay, I can see how a church growth person could look at this book and say, yeah, what can we glean from this to be able to plant churches? That's the sort of language, isn't it? We've got to plant churches, we've got to do this and that. And yet when you go to different countries, I mean, so how many countries did you go to? I know you went to South America, you went to South Africa, I think you went to South Korea. Was it only countries that had the word South in the title? Because I was thinking, you don't like North? Is that, you don't want to go to North Korea for sure. There's probably not a lot of Pentecostal churches in North Korea, but you travel all over the world. You're doing all this research, but yet each place that you go to, it's kind of syncretistic. It's kind of got its own local flavor, but you can still see those distinctives, as you say, coming through from that American experience.
Very much so. I actually have been to North Korea, and I interviewed North Korean refugees in my book, because a lot of North Korean refugees in the South tend to convert. I think we worked it out as, I think I went to 12 countries and about 6 US states, although I think it was actually more like 8, but some stuff I had to cut out. So yeah, basically what I tried to do, I suppose, in the book was trying to find sort of the key elements. So, healing, prosperity gospel, that idea of, minorities and being alienated. When I write about the British Gypsy people, conversion to Pentecostalism, sort of making them a bit acceptable in modern Britain, and a lot of sort of quite strange ideas about existing in modern society. So I tried to take those kind of ideas and just match them up to the main centers of Pentecostalism around the world. So South Korea, I told the story of North Korean migrants trying to make it there, and how, again, alienating big city. Pentecostalism is a very aspirational faith in a lot of these places. And, the journey of healing, I wrote about that in South Africa, and prosperity gospel in Brazil, where it's still a really big thing in Brazil. And there's some really interesting evidence that it works, that people tend to get their lives together once they join a Pentecostal church. And I know that's a really big thing in South America is addiction. Men with alcohol problems specifically, and drug problems, if they join a Pentecostal church, it's the best route to kicking the habit, better than any other secular or other kind of treatment.
12-step program.
Something that's just joining Pentecostal church, because you build a community, you have accountability networks, all the kind of things that are important. And in a lot of these places, it's only really a church that's providing those solidarity networks. And I think that's really important. I mean, the sort of overarching critique in my book is really just the failure of a lot of modern states to provide this stuff is what's sending people into the arms of the church. And it's not a judgment call about whether going to church is a good or a bad thing. It's just saying that a lot of people, the stories just keep replicating that they need something in life. They need support networks. They're in a big city. They're a single mom. They've got an addiction problem, whatever. And the church for so many people is the only place that you can get that.
They can get that support network. As you say, we're not getting into the theology of it as to whether or not that's down to the Holy Spirit or God working, or is it just, like you say, a system that could be relevant to like a 12-step program? You have that community, you have that accountability, you have that support. You could kick drinking or drugs completely in a secular context. So yeah, is that the case? I don't know. But what did you find when you went to these different countries? There's similarities, but there's also some key differences. What do you find, like, for example, from South America to South Africa, or Nigeria, you went to some of these other countries. What did you see in terms of the differences between the local expression of Pentecostalism in these various countries?
For sure. So one of the, again, another key theme of my book is, I think part of the success of Pentecostalism is its decentralized nature, that it can look and sound like the local culture, and that's really important to people. And it's really important, again, to making it relevant to their lives. And yeah, there's no Pope, there's no Archbishop of Canterbury, it's local preachers just giving people what they want. It's very, very, very neoliberal. I kind of hate using that word, but it really fits into the kind of into the modern world, in that it's very much, the customer's always right. we're in a marketplace of ideas. If someone doesn't like this preacher, they can get out and walk down the street and see another one, or they can go online and find a guy that they like. So preachers in the Pentecostal faith are really highly attuned to what people want. And yeah, all around the world, it's in some places it's really syncretic. In South Africa, I did a healing ceremony with a well-ish known prophet there. It felt as though it would have been very similar to a traditional they're Bantu peoples. He's from Zimbabwe originally, something that a traditional African practice in a lot of ways, with a bit of biblical stuff and speaking in tongues over the top of that. And again, people go to these healing in traditional culture. They're called sagomas. In Pentecostal, they often call themselves prophets or something like that. And again, it's the failure of the state. This is often the only game in town for a lot of people. I mean, this is in inner city Johannesburg, but for a lot of people, they can't afford to go to a doctor. And the other thing is, I mean, it's speaking to their, a lot of people's spiritual conception of the world. I think, especially, growing up as a fairly secular person in the West, it's very hard. Sometimes you don't realize it's very stupid, just how spiritual the rest of the world is. You tend to think that, because, America is the most powerful nation, where that everywhere is going to be just like New York City or something. And obviously it's not, but just that spiritual conception of the world is the dominant conception of the world. Pretty much everywhere, all the cultures in Africa and Latin America, will have a much more spiritual conception, and that speaks to people's understanding of the world. In Nigeria, where Pentecostals, some of the mega church leaders are incredibly powerful there. They essentially are kingmakers for the presidency. And it's very complex with the mix of Islamic and Christian people in the country. But they basically have a deal with whoever's prime minister, and it's often a Muslim person, is that, in order for us to anoint you, almost as president, you will speak about the world in spiritual terms. Conceptions of good and evil. Spiritual warfare is something that people will openly use in everyday political speech in Nigeria. And that's at first I sort of thought, that's almost a strange bargain. They don't really care if it's one of their guys, so long as they're speaking these terms. But obviously that's what gives them so much power and so much relevance. So they don't necessarily, I mean, president of Nigeria, it's a thankless task. It's a broken, corrupt nation. It's sort of three different cultures melded together. It's got so many problems. But yeah, if you can just get the most powerful people in the country talking in your language, that's huge.
I found that so fascinating when you talked about Nigeria, as you say. So it's a country that comes out of colonialism. You've got a Muslim culture and a Christian culture and a Catholic culture, I guess, these three. And then you've got a tribalism welded into that somehow. But then, I didn't know this, but you talk about there's like Islamic charismatic, whatever they call it, not a mosque, but a temple, I guess you could say, where now they're starting to compete with the Pentecostals to attract people, So what's that about? That's a whole nother movement now in places like Nigeria.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it is in a mosque, actually. So it's called NASFAT. I won't try to pronounce the name, but that's the acronym. So yeah, I mean, Nigeria is just a fascinating place. Anyway, it'll be the third most populous country in the world in a couple of decades, and it's really important, I think, that people get a better understanding of it, like we might have of China or India. But yeah, it was, it was, I think there's about 250 different sort of distinct tribal cultures in Nigeria, but they're generally divided into the three different centers. So where I wrote about this group was in Lagos, which is not the capital, but the biggest city. And it's the biggest city in Africa. It's about 20 million people. It's a sprawling mega city. People from all over the continent, go there to ply business, to chase their dreams or whatever. It's hugely corrupt with oil money, pretty poor infrastructure. And this is where basically the Yoruba people live. And they've generally always been about 50-50 Islamic and Christian. And it was very common, the streets aren't necessarily divided, but, there aren't distinct Islamic and Christian neighborhoods. A lot of people might grow up with a Muslim father and a Christian mother. And this is basically where the movement of what we call charismatic or born again Islam comes out of. So a lot of people, it was just quite normal if that's your upbringing, that, on Friday, you'll go to mosque with dad, and on Sunday, you'll go to church with mom. And what's happened is since the Pentecostals have really got going since the 80s in Nigeria, and there's huge mega churches, hundreds of thousands of people can go there at a time, flashy preachers, the lot, prosperity gospel, health and wealth, all the classic Pentecostal stuff. Since they really got going, they're attracting a lot of younger people. And again, it just really fits into the story of Lagos. People might spend hours a day in traffic. So Pentecostal churches put on speed dating nights, because if you're working all day and then, 3 hours in traffic to and from work, you're never going to meet a partner. So churches are, again, just providing this infrastructure for people's lives and stepping in, for due to the failures of the state. And yeah, so it's these kind of things, and, the music and all that kind of stuff that started seeing a lot of people, stop going to mosque on Friday with dad and maybe just go to church on Sunday. So NASFAT got together. They were, it was in the 90s. So it was a group of, one of the founders told me a group of elites came together, which I found funny. It's like the only people in the world still using elite in a positive sense. But that's quite important to them, because when people tend to think of Islam in Nigeria, they think of Boko Haram. And these guys do not want, they're trying to show Islam in a far more positive light. And so they came together and started this society. They get very upset when I've asked them, are they borrowing from Pentecostals and are they charismatic or born again? They really don't like any of that. But myself and other academics have been there and seen it ourselves, and it's pretty obvious what they're doing. Because one of the big things is that they have started holding mosque on Sundays. They hold their normal Salah prayers on Friday, but they'll start holding mosque at the same time as church on Sunday to try and get people going. And I went in and had to go and sit in the ladies section. Traditional mosque, everything covered up and headscarf, and they gave me the book, and then you sort of see in very front, if you kind of squint in the men's section, and there were some TVs, an imam in traditional white robes and everything, but sort of running up and down the aisles doing, praise Allah, praise Allah. It's so really surreal. Something. Yeah, and they're a bit in. The Islamic faith have their the name escapes me for tithing, but they sort of have alms and charity things that they encourage people to do. It's sort of the reverse of prosperity gospel. It's basically said bad things happen to you if you don't give a certain amount of your money to charity. And but they've kind of taken on a lot of these practices to try and stem the flow. No one knows exactly how many, but the head of the Muslim council in Nigeria told me that he thinks they've lost about 1 million Muslims to Pentecostal churches in the last 10 or so years. So they're really concerned about it, and also that the Pentecostals, some of the very prominent leaders are really starting to stoke up hatred and violence against Muslim people.
And this could be one of the downsides to missional work. You're wiping out a cultural elements in another country. And you talk about reverse mission. This is another thing. I was a part of this because I used to teach at a Bible college up in Leeds for about, 5 or 6 years. And all of my students there were from either Eritrea or Ethiopia. And this is fascinating because they were part of this movement called reverse missions, which is now you get like second and third generation Africans who were taught their theology by Western missionaries. Now they're looking at places like Britain and America, and they're saying they need the gospel more so than we do. So they're moving to places like the UK with a view to, starting churches here. And what's fascinating to me was that on the one hand, they're totally charismatic Pentecostal. They believe in tongues and healings and miracles and prophecies and all those things that you would associate with a charismatic and Pentecostal side. But yet their theology was extremely fundamentalist. So there's this weird kind of mix of very rigid doctrine and dogma with this exuberant over the top Pentecostal sort of worship and style. I don't know how do they reconcile all that?
Yeah, it's really fascinating phenomenon. I'd hope to get to Ethiopia because they're Pentecostalizing really quickly. I think the president, who's currently waging a pretty nasty war, I'm pretty sure he's Pentecostal. But yeah, I wasn't able to get to Ethiopia apart from getting a flight through there for Nigeria, just because of logistics and pandemic and everything. But yeah, it's a real phenomenon that we're seeing coming out of Africa, South Korea, and parts of Latin America as well. Is this idea of reverse evangelism? So it's kind of like the West, generally the US and the UK, they say, you guys brought us the good news, and now look at you, you're letting gays get married. That's the way. Gay marriage is the really big thing, and just also generally, kind of secular liberalism. You'll find a lot of people in those countries, quite pro-Trump, quite might have an interest in Brexit and things like that. And yeah, that they think that the West that brought them the good news has lost their way, and they need to help, to re-evangelize those countries. In South Korea, it's been a really big thing since 9/11. And since the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, there was quite a infamous incident where a huge busload of Korean missionaries were kidnapped in Afghanistan, I think. Because they kind of said to America, oh, no, like you guys are too on the nose. If we're going to, Americans can't go to those countries and spread the word. I mean, you'll just all get killed. And the Koreans have sort of said, we'll step up. We'll try the Middle East.
We can go.
Yeah, so that's quite a powerful thing to a lot of people who have that missionary zeal. Although, interestingly, I did speak to someone from the biggest church in South Korea who said that they did have some missionaries for a couple of decades in a Middle Eastern country. They wouldn't tell me which one. And they said after a couple of decades, the only person they converted was their maid.
Oh, right. Not much success.
Yeah.
Very
so
difficult.
I don't think it's particularly successful, but I mean, certainly for diaspora communities, in places like London, where there's huge West African populations, for a lot of people, I think maintaining their church ties is really a way of maintaining the connection with their culture. A young Nigerian kid that might be born and bred in London, that's his way maybe of still being able to connect with his grandparents back in Lagos and things like that. So it's often sort of a way of, you can be anyone in London, but you can, still connect to your roots and by going to church each week.
It's true. And I mean, it's kind of off the subject, but the students that I had, the problems that they were dealing with was, like you say, they've got second and third generation kids who were born in this country, and yet they don't necessarily even speak their languages that they brought with them, whatever language they spoke in Africa. So they've started these churches, and in the churches, they don't speak English. So they're not they're not going to attract their, let's say, their British neighbors, as it were, who don't speak their languages. So that's they're trying to work around all these logistical and, church growth problems. So that's the kind of dissertations my students were working on, at the time. How do we break out, but yet still preserve our own culture and yet reach out to the wider sort of British white culture? And I mean, Leeds and Bradford is a huge area for people from India, from Pakistan. I mean, so you've got all these mixes of races coming together. So it's a fascinating thing to see how they'll work it out. When we return from the break with Elle Hardy, we're going to get into a subject that I've done a lot of work on the last couple of years, and that is, of course, the issue of dominion theology, and specifically the last half of her book deals with this area of what's called the Seven Mountains Mandate dominion theology, which specifically seems to be sort of a subset within dominion theology in terms of the more charismatic, the more Pentecostal side of this belief system that's rapidly, it's the fastest growing Christian denomination in the world, isn't it? So hope you've enjoyed the first half with Elle, and I think you're going to really get a lot out of the second half as we get more into the issue, I suppose, of the more political aspects of charismatic Pentecostal Christianity. I just wanted to let you know what's coming up here in the next few episodes here on Mindshift Podcast. I've got some really fantastic guests lined up. In fact, tonight, as I'm doing this recording now, I'm talking to Andrew D., who reached out to me a few weeks ago. He's from the religiousaddicts.wordpress.com blog, and he wants to talk. I'm not sure if we're going to do a podcast, but that might end up happening. And then I've got a bunch of guests booked pretty much for the rest of the month. On the 10th of the month, I'm going to be talking to returning guest Rebecca Drumsta. She was on the podcast a while ago, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. She's just come out with a brand new book called When Family Hurts, and I was fortunate enough to be able to do a little endorsement for the book, so I really want to talk to Rebecca about that. And in fact, I think she's going to be our guest on the next monthly Mindshift Zoom call. In fact, speaking of which, while I'm thinking about that, that's coming up here on the 9th of January. We've got Jonathan Larson, who unfortunately wasn't able to make our December Mindshift Zoom call due to a scheduling snafu, but Jonathan's booked back in, so he's going to be coming up just a couple days after this particular podcast drops here. So I'm going to have Rebecca coming in, I think, in the month of February. We're going to talk about her book. Then I've got another returning guest, Dr. Death, Terry Daniel, Dr. Terry Daniel. She's been on the podcast before. She is going to be putting together a conference this summer that I'm fortunate enough to be one of the speakers at, alongside of some other guests like Seth Andrews. I was on his podcast a while ago. That is going to be a fantastic one. So Terry Daniel and I are going to talk about that. And then finally, on the 24th of January, I've got Dr. David Andre, and I'm really fascinated. I've been talking to him on Facebook, actually. I met up with him. He's a good friend of Sherry Palace, Dr. Sherry Palace, the Fireside Creators, and he's one of the sort of main bloggers and writers on that show, and I've been interacting with him a lot. We have a lot of similarities, a lot of things in common coming out of both teaching theology in sort of a Bible college seminary setting. He has since deconstructed and writes a lot of posts, particularly on Facebook, on that Fireside Creators page. So if you want to look up some of his stuff, take a look at Dr. David Andre. So really good guest coming up. And then, like I said, we're going to have, I think, Rebecca come back in January, or I should say February, to be our guest on the Mindshift Zoom call that we do every month. And then later this month in January, we're going to be hosting our first annual 2022 Mindshift Patrons Only call. This is another benefit that you get for being a Patreon supporter of the show. So thank you, everyone who did support the show over the last couple years. Greatly appreciated. The links to that are always in the show notes. So if you want to become a Patreon supporter, you can make that your New Year's resolution. Help me out and help kind of meet my expenses. So that would be greatly appreciated. So let's get on back into the second half of this chat with Elle Hardy as we get into this issue of Seven Mountains Mandate, Dominion Theology. We're going to talk about Bethel Redding, Bill and Benny Johnson, some really bizarre stuff going on there. So I hope you enjoy the second half of this chat as we get into this issue of Beyond Belief inside the rise of global Pentecostalism. Now, there's another aspect to this whole discussion, and I'd love to talk about the sociological aspects of it, but there's a dominionist piece to it as well, because you mentioned spiritual warfare. That's another distinctive of charismatic and Pentecostal theology. But in the States, and it's now spreading worldwide, isn't it? You've got this sort of charismatic arm of dominion theology, the Seven Mountains Mandate dominion theology. How are you seeing that playing out, not just in America, but even in worldwide in Pentecostalism?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So in the book, I sort of try to chart, I suppose, the rise of the movement and explain, the sociological things we talked about as to why they're getting so many people in the tent. And a big thing I'm trying to do is not judge people for their faith or whatever, and just sort of say, hey, this is going on, this is interesting. But the one thing that really does trouble me is two doctrines that have really come out of the movement and that I'm finding are quite influential in the world at the moment. So there's spiritual warfare. We'll come back to that. That's certainly more of a global South thing, I think. Yeah, so Seven Mountain Mandate. So a few guys who were involved in the Reagan administration and just general 80s American Christianity had this idea in 1975, and then it kind of lay dormant, basically. And a guy called Lance Wallnau picked it up in, I think, 2011. He's an American, a Texas businessman, and went back to study theology at University of Phoenix, which I think you might have heard is that kind of dodgy. It's not really a university. Yeah.
Not exactly a mainstream. What you think of when you think wasn't Oxford or Cambridge exactly.
Yeah. It's not even your kind of local community college. It's extremely for-profit, shall we say.
Right.
So this is, might give you a few clues as to the kind of guy he is. So he picked it up and co-authored a book with Bill Johnson from Bethel Ministries in California, who's a very influential leader who has somewhat distanced himself from it, interestingly. So they co-authored the Seven Mountains Mandate. So it basically says that there are seven mountains or spheres of society. So it's family, religion, military, business, education,
arts, entertainment, media,
entertainment.
Government,
government, and that the modern believer needs to go out and conquer all of those areas. So it's a real call to arms, and it's very, you can kind of see when you think about the time it came out around 2011, it's very Tea Party. And I think it's very much you're seeing with the kind of MAGA today, which is almost, reconstituted Tea Party. folks is that very bottom up. It's very knowing that they've lost the demographic battle, knowing that they can't really win democratically anymore. So it's just kind of like, just fuck it, grab your gun and go take over the local school board and tell them you're taking it back for God. You know, as some people have been doing recently in Colorado and some other places. It's a very it's a real call to arms, and you know, there's some people sort of influenced by Lance Wallnau and Andrew Womack, who's involved in a lot of Liberty and Koch brothers aligned projects and stuff in Texas. Those are the two guys who are really pushing it, and you know, there's a lot of some people who did the January 6th insurrection were inspired by them and spoke about it. And they, you know, that was sort of an interesting army of lone wolves. You know, you had your QAnon guys dressing up and all that, but the guys who were theologically inspired seem to really be inspired by this movement. And it's, Lance Wallnau really troubles me. He's I don't know if creepy is the right word, but I've watched a lot of him on Facebook. You know, he was doing nightly shows in the pandemic. So this is a very American movement, but I could really see it in the pandemic, you know, spreading through Facebook, you know, through people all over the world who are just kind of stumbling on these broadcasts. And you can see that the idea of leading up to the election and after the election, that he almost found the kind of violence, you could see the excitement in his eyes. He finds it titillating. And so he's kind of one of those guys that you go, I just got a vibe about you, like you find this thrilling. And so he's really sort of been pushing it out, and you're just seeing it more and more. So you're hearing guys like Charlie Kirk from Turning Points USA, that kind of campus activist group that I think they get a fair amount of Koch brothers money as well. But he'll make mentions of seven mountains or seven spheres, and it's just one of those ideas that's kind of percolating, but it's certainly inspiring people. And when people are doing some pretty awful things, they're just grabbing around for whatever they can to hold on to inspire and justify what they're doing. And people are finding all sorts of things, and a lot of people are finding the Seven Mountains Mandate now.
Well, you mentioned another major player in this Seven Mountains Mandate stuff, and that's David Barton of Wall Builders. I've done episodes on him before, and of course he's a quote unquote historian, but a lot of this is tied to Christian nationalism as well, which is his big gambit, isn't it? Where he's pushing this sort of narrative that says America was a Christian nation, we were founded by expressly Christians to be a Christian nation. We've lost that now. We've got to go back to it. So the means by which we could do that would be, as you say, the seven mountains. If we could just take control of these seven mountains of culture, or the seven spheres of influence, we could Christianize America again. And he's got a massive following. And he's always on Kenneth Copeland's Believer's Voice of Victory. He gives tours in the Washington Capitol. He's obviously got his Wall Builders organization. He's doing homeschooling curriculum. I mean, this guy's like everywhere, and they see his name just popping up. He was involved in Project Blitz, which you talk about in the book as well. So these guys are involved in they got their fingers in a lot of pies, don't they?
Yeah, and it's they all appear on each other's shows as well. So he's very closely involved with Andrew Womack and Lance Wallnau, the Truth and Liberty Coalition. But yeah, I mean, Barton I think he was vice president of the Texas GOP for a while.
Yeah, he was.
Very closely linked in. Yeah, my friend Ann Nelson, she wrote a great book called The Shadow Network, and trying to tie together all of these religious and right-wing and Koch brothers, you know, big money funded kind of groups, and they always, you know, the circle is pretty small in those things. The
same names pop up.
Yeah.
They all seem to speak at each other's churches, and you see people like Cindy Jacobs and Lance Wallnau, and it was big during the Trump presidency, wasn't it? That Evangelical Advisory Board, a lot of the people on that board, like Paula White Cain, some of the other big names, Maldonado, these guys were all part of that Pentecostal charismatic movement, which was all allied to that Seven Mountains Dominion theology, I think, as well.
Very much so. And I mean, if you look at Trump, my friend, Dr. David Smith, he's a professor in US studies in Sydney University. He did some really good looking into this stuff early on. And he noticed that, you know, when the evangelical bloc that got behind Trump really early, you know, when his candidacy was sort of a joke, they were all Pentecostal. And I think that's really important. It's that very anti-elite movement. It's that, you know, it's what you feel, you know, it all ties in so well. No one can tell me what to do. You know, it's all very independent. It's entrepreneurial. that whole thing. So yeah, it was the Pentecostals, not necessarily just the evangelicals that got behind Trump early. And I think that is really significant. Yeah, but I mean, in terms of the Seven Mountain Mandate, I mean, it's just rebadge Christian dominionism, however you like to call it. But yeah, I think it is really important that it's coming through now, because as I said, yeah, I think that they know that they've lost the demographic battle. America is a very blue country. It's just gerrymandered, that's gerrymandering and vote suppression is the only thing that's keeping the Republicans in it, and they're keenly aware of that. They know it better than the Democrats do, you know.
And it's fascinating too, because a lot of these so-called prophets and apostles, which is again part of that Pentecostal movement, charismatic side, they were the ones that were predicting Trump was going to win re-election. They all prophesied that Trump was going to win, and it was a word from God and all the rest of it. Then when he didn't win, they went right into the big lie, because of course they're vested in it. They couldn't be seen to have a false prophecy. That would be unbiblical to say that if you predicted an event and it did not come to pass, and you said God told you that was going to happen and it didn't happen, that is by definition a false prophecy. That makes you a false prophet. So of course the only thing they can do is double down and say, well, he did win. The election was stolen and it's all going to be revealed and all the rest of it. So, this is all part and parcel of this sort of worldview, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, it seems that they have fairly willing people. I mean, how long? I suspect that in time, it's just that they'll pivot, pretty quickly to, if Trump doesn't run, DeSantis still, is the, the new Trump or whatever. Guy. Yeah, I mean, again, the thing is that it's just one of the real features of modern Pentecostals is how media savvy they are. And like I was saying, it's the same story, Pentecostals and charismatics around the world, that they're just so good at picking up the zeitgeist, at noticing. And I mean, these guys like Warnow and stuff, they'd be getting most of their income through Facebook and things like that. So if the viewers are dropping off, or if the viewers are spiking when they're talking about something, they will double down on that. So it'll be really interesting, actually, I think, to watch them, that they in some ways will have a better sense of where things are going. I mean, certainly better than any bloody political consultant. But if they start pivoting to something, an idea, it's probably because they're getting viewers for it. So in many ways that they've got their ear to the ground a lot more than most other people, and seeing where they go next. And the fact that, I mean, a lot of them are still very big on Trump, I think tells you that's still popular, it still resonates. People are, you're still getting eyeballs and you're still getting donations.
You mentioned Bill Johnson, Bethel Redding. What's fascinating, I've done a lot of research on what's going on in Bethel Redding, and it's fascinating because I see it as a cautionary tale. I think it's a case study, what that church is doing to the town of Redding. You could say, okay, they've distanced themselves from the Seven Mountains Mandate, but they're in effect, they are making this all happen because they're in charge of businesses in the town. They're in charge of media, entertainment, education, politics, and all the rest of it. And people in Redding are almost afraid to speak out. This is what would happen if Christians were actually to take over. You've got these roving gangs of young guys, going out and forcibly, praying for people and trying to raise people from the dead. And there's been all this controversy in the town of Redding. I mean, to me, that's how I see it. I don't know. What's your take on Bethel Redding?
Yeah, it's a creepy town, actually. It's, I've lived in the deep South of America and been to some, small towns where people don't like fake news media and stuff, but, they'll still have that gorgeous Southern hospitality, invite you in and you're drinking with their mother on the front porch, while they're telling you how awful
all the
you
stereotypes.
are, but, being absolutely lovely about it. Yeah, there's a real hostility in Redding, which really quite puzzled me. Very lucky having, I find Americans incredibly generous, kind, curious people, and having an Australian accent is just an amazing passport there. People always want to talk to you, and but Redding, they don't. They've a very much sense of, you're an outsider and what are you doing here? And that's, I mean, that, the chapter in the book, I say it's a company town, and the company is Bethel. Yeah, something like 11% of the population go to the church, in a town of about 90,000 people. They, until recently, they had the mayor. They always tend to have someone on city council. They control the board of commerce, or I can't think what it is. I think it's board of commerce. Any philanthropic organization there, they've got TED Talks into it. They've got an angel investing community to help small businesses and stuff. almost all the people there are Bethel. They've decided, because Bill Johnson's wife, Benny, is quite new agey, shall we say, in her beliefs on health, rabidly anti-vax and all that kind of stuff, even well before, the pandemic. And she decided that that Redding was going to be a cancer-free zone. And so they've got, from what I can work out, they've got probably at least 25% of the hospital doctors in the town that are Bethel affiliated. They meet people on conferences, at Christian conferences that are doctors, and they lure them to the town. So prayer groups from the church are allowed to go into the hospitals and pray, and in waiting rooms and stuff. I spoke to some medical workers, and again, everyone's very wary of speaking out against the church because it just doesn't make your life worth it. People talk about being harassed out of their jobs and stuff like that for people that run a watchdog Facebook group. But yeah, they've, hospital workers have told me, it's you just get before COVID, you get the emergency ward just flooded with people going around to pray on people, and it's not always with their consent.
Yeah, I've heard many stories about that. You mentioned that in the book. There was a woman, I think, in a wheelchair that got accosted by a group of Bethelites, and they said, "We want to pray for you. We're gonna, God's gonna heal you." And she said, "No, I do not want you to." And they just ignored her consent and just forcibly. I think they stopped her wheelchair, didn't they? Physically,
they put their feet under her wheelchair, and I mean that's humiliating. That is you would never feel so powerless as to have that happen. And that was actually one of the founders of this Facebook watchdog group was her daughter. And to this day, I speak to her daughter, who's, sort of in her 50s, I would say, and she's still bubbling with rage about what they did to her mom. And I think I would be the same if someone did that to my mom. I'd probably devote the rest of my life to trying to take them down. Yeah,
absolutely. I don't want to live in a world where to me, it's more like the cult psychology. I mean, I've studied Bethel Redding. To me, it's more like akin to some type of cult, more of a cultic movement than anything else, because it's just a bunch of devotees who are just absolutely sold on this vision of, spiritual warfare and prayer and healing and miracles and everything else. And they believe that gold dust comes down from the inside of the auditorium and feathers, and it's all a miraculous, revealing of God and the Holy Spirit. I mean, that to me sounds more like a cult than anything else. I don't know what your take on it is.
I'm fairly wary of using cult stuff, just because I think it's still, to me, is an organized religion. I mean, I understand why people get that, and I mean, I think definitely Bethel, I think they're getting more corporately aware, shall we say, and trying to move away from a bit of the really crazy stuff officially, but they really stoke it on the side, through Benny. Mm-hmm. Benny's Instagram is a journey, shall we say?
Yeah, grave soaking.
Yeah. All that.
That's kind of a weird one.
Yeah, Bill tries to very much be be a very sensible front man now, which is why they moved away from Seven Mountain stuff and that kind of thing. But they certainly let it happen on the sides. I mean, Sean Focht, I can't say his name, the blonde curly hair musician who goes around the country.
Oh, Sean Focht.
Yeah, Focht. Yeah,
that's
doing
him.
The anti-lockdown rallies. He's a Bethel guy, but they say he trained here, but he's not part of our church anymore. Welcome to
distancing themselves.
Yeah. Although recently, they actually Bethel did a kind of video cast trying to. I think they might have over distanced themselves from Seven Mountains mandate.
Right.
And they were trying, But I mean, I've spoken to their communications guy, and he's actually lovely, a really pious guy, really theologically smart. Seems to be one of those. A lot of younger Pentecostals I find really do want to do good in the world, and they think that the church is, the best way to do it. And, especially in a lot of places in the global South, it's the only place that can organize stuff. But yeah, so I think he's sort of tried to lead them away from some of the very fringe aspects. And I don't know if they're starting to feel like they've gone a bit too far, because they're trying to come back and reclaim a bit of that stuff now. So it's very interesting to watch. And I mean, they've all really studied the stuff that Wimber and Wagner were talking about with the routinization of churches. And I think they do get quite aware that if you standardize your worship too much, you will lose people. People want that spontaneous, miraculous. They want the fun stuff. And so I don't know, but they're kind of interesting me in the moment. I feel like, I don't know if there's a bit of an ideological struggle going on, or again, if they're just, if YouTube views are going down, and maybe gold dust is, gets your YouTube views up. Maybe you start the gold dust and the feathers again. I don't know.
Start the gold dust and feathers. Yeah. Gold fillings or whatever it is that, all sorts of crazy miracles they have. Well, listen,
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you too long. I know you're still struggling with COVID. You've been
Sorry, my
coughing in the
throat.
background. Your throat's getting dry. Your book is called Beyond Belief, How Pentecostal Christianity has Taken Over the World. It's just come out, according to Amazon, on the 30th of November. So it's literally just now available, isn't it? You can get it on Amazon. Where else can you get the book?
Yeah, sure. So it's just come out in the UK on the 30th. There's been some supply chain issues, so it's only really just getting into Waterstones and kind of all the stores now. But it's certainly, yeah, on Amazon, or you can buy it through my publisher, Hearst, or through an independent bookstore. It's coming out in Australia on the 1st of February. And it should be coming out sometime around mid-March, I think, in the US, again, just dependent on supply chain issues, because that's affecting publishing. But yeah, it's if you just Google Elle Hardy Beyond Belief, you should be able to find it.
So just a quick question then, if people wanted to get a hold of you on social media, what's the best place to find you?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Elle Hardy, so ELLEHARDY. Yeah, and that's my main social media. I'm on there far too much. I'm a journalist, so that's unfortunately, you'll see that I spend a ridiculous amount of my day posting.
I know, but social media is the way forward, and it's the way to promote your work. So I'm glad I was able to get the word out a little bit about your book. I've enjoyed reading it. I've got about a quarter of it left. I'm interested to see how you're going to bring it all to a conclusion. So if people want to learn more about the spread of global Pentecostalism, this is a great resource. So thank you, Elle, for taking the time out to chat with me.
Cool. Thanks for having me. And yeah, apologies for my voice.
Not a problem. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Thanks very much.